Some folks spend their lives chasing horizons, convinced that the big break, the lottery ticket, the perfect storm of opportunity is just around the next bend. They scan the skies for a sign, for that one thunderclap moment that'll shake their world right side up. And sure, sometimes lightning strikes. But for most of us, the real magic, the genuine dividing line between a life dreamed and a life lived, it ain't some grand spectacle. It's far quieter, far more mundane, and yet utterly profound. It's a whisper, a tiny vibration, a silent argument you have with yourself before the sun even thinks about showing its face. It's the constant pull between the comfort of the familiar and the terrifying promise of the untried. It's about a daily decision, see? Not a promise you make once and forget. Not some grand, sweeping declaration for the ages, but a choice you make over and over when nobody's watching, when no applause is waiting, when the only witness is the cold, hard face of the clock and the quiet hum of your own doubts. It's the difference between picking up that single tool, making that one call, writing that one sentence, or just letting the weight of tomorrow pile up a little higher until tomorrow becomes next week and next week melts into next year. And there was a man, a good man, who knew this truth deep in his bones, though for a long time he just hadn't seen it for what it was. He was caught in the current of waiting, always waiting for the perfect moment that never quite arrived. His name was Wyatt, and he was 43 years old, though the deep lines etched around his eyes and the slight stoop in his shoulders sometimes made him look a decade older. He worked the third shift at the old Hendershot manufacturing plant, the kind of place that smelled permanently of hot metal, hydraulic fluid, and decades of forgotten ambition, a smell that clung to your clothes and seeped into your skin. You wouldn't pick Wyatt out of a crowd. He wasn't loud, wasn't flashy, didn't have a story to tell to every new face. Just a regular guy, sturdy and unassuming, in a faded blue work shirt, sleeves always rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle, testimony to years spent wrestling with stubborn machinery and heavy loads. Wyatt's hands were his story. Calloused, rough to the touch, scarred in places from minor burns and errant slivers of metal, the knuckles permanently swollen, stiff with the ache of repetition. But look closer, and you'd see a delicate precision in those hands, a painter's touch when he aligned a piece of steel, a surgeon's steadiness as he guided a welding torch. They were the hands of a craftsman, even if the only things they crafted for a paycheck were perfectly aligned seams on sheet metal, thousands of them, day in and day out, components for products he'd never see completed. He carried himself with a quiet strength, a stillness that often made others underestimate the deep currents running beneath his surface. When he spoke, which wasn't often, it was usually to offer a useful observation, a practical solution to a thorny problem on the line, or a dry, understated joke that caught you off guard and left a faint smile lingering. More often, he just listened, his gaze steady, taking it all in, processing the world with a thoughtful quietude. His eyes, though, that's where the real story played out. They were a muted blue, usually tired, ringed with the perpetual shadow of early mornings and late nights, reflecting the subtle weariness of a life lived on someone else's schedule. But if you caught them just right, when he was looking off into the distance, perhaps contemplating a particularly intricate design in his mind, or tracing the imaginary lines of a new project, you'd see a flicker. A spark of something still alive, still dreaming, fighting against the relentless tide of routine that threatened to drown it completely. It was a spark he tried to keep hidden, a secret ambition he nursed in the quiet hours spent sketching in his garage, an ember that occasionally flared with the hope of a different future, only to dim again under the crushing weight of self-doubt, the fear of not being ready, the nagging worry that it all had to be perfect before it could even begin. Wyatt was dependable, all right, as steady and predictable as the rhythmic hum of the machinery he tended. But inside, beneath that unflappable exterior, he was a silent battleground, a testament to the quiet war fought daily between what you are and what you desperately want to become. He knew what it felt like to stand at the very edge of his own potential, his own personal promised land, and then, for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, turn around and walk away, telling himself he'd come back tomorrow, always waiting for that perfect moment. Every man knows that feeling, doesn't he? That whisper in the back of your head that tells you there's more, that you're meant for something bigger than the daily grind. For Wyatt, that whisper was a constant companion, a ghost in the machine of his predictable life. His days began before the sun even thought about stretching. The alarm on his phone, set for 5 a.m., was less a sound and more a physical jolt, ripping him from the shallow sleep of a man who worked hard and worried harder. He'd swing his legs out of bed, the cold floorboards a shock against his bare feet in the small, tidy house his parents had left him. Everything in that house was practical, functional, much like Wyatt himself. His movements were economical, practiced over 2 decades of factory shifts. Coffee brewed while he splashed water on his face, the mirror showing a 43-year-old reflection with more lines around the eyes than he remembered from last year, and a faint stubble that would soon meet the sharp bite of a razor. Breakfast was always the same. Oatmeal black coffee, eaten in silence at the kitchen table, the dim light from the single bulb illuminating the worn edges of his hands. Hands that were strong, calloused, bearing the marks of a lifetime spent shaping metal, not for his own dream, but for someone else's bottom line. Hands that could build anything if only given the chance to truly start. By 5:45 a.m., he was in his pickup truck, a dependable relic that had seen better days, navigating the half-lit streets of his working-class neighborhood. The air, thick with the damp chill of pre-dawn, carried the distant hum of industry, a sound that had been the soundtrack to his entire adult life. He pulled into the factory parking lot precisely at 6 a.m., parking in his usual spot, walking the same worn path to the time clock, punching in with the steady rhythm of a man resigned to his fate. The factory floor was a symphony of grinding metal, whirring gears, and the guttural roar of presses. The smell of hot oil and ozone hung heavy in the air, a familiar scent that clung to his clothes and hair even after a shower. Wyatt moved through it all with quiet efficiency, his station a small island of focused labor amidst the chaos. He operated the cutting machine, feeding it sheets of raw steel, watching as the blade descended with a hiss and a thud, turning potential into uniform parts. Hour after hour, day after day, week after week. It paid the bills, kept the roof over his head, put gas in the tank. But it was a tightrope walk always. A breakdown in the truck, a sudden medical bill for his elderly mother a few towns over, any one of those could send him tumbling into the red. He wasn't complaining, not out loud anyway. That wasn't his way. But the quiet anxiety was a constant companion, a dull ache beneath the surface of his calm exterior. He watched the clock, not with impatience, but with the steady anticipation of a man whose time was never truly his own. The whistle blew at 3 p.m., a blessed release, and he'd drive home, the exhaustion in his bones a physical weight, his mind already half checked out. He'd make a simple dinner, maybe call his mother to check in, and then often he'd find himself gravitating towards the detached garage in his backyard. His workshop, his sanctuary, his biggest source of quiet frustration. The detached garage wasn't just a garage, it was a mausoleum of half-born dreams, a dusty shrine to a life unlived. He'd push open the heavy door, the hinges groaning like an old man waking, and the faint scent of metal dust, cutting oil, and untapped potential would fill his lungs. Under the single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, his world shifted. Here, the hum of the factory was replaced by the silent promise of a different kind of clang. A vintage metal lathe, a gift from his father, sat gleaming faintly in the corner. His welding rig, a sturdy, no-frills machine, waited patiently, its thick cables coiled neatly. Piles of scrap metal, beautiful, raw, ready to be transformed, lay in organized stacks. Wyatt wasn't just a factory worker. He was, in his heart, a metal artist. His hands, calloused and strong from years of repetitive labor, also held the delicate touch of a craftsman. He'd spent countless evenings, not working in the garage, but planning. Sketchbooks filled with intricate designs for gates, railings that flowed like water, whimsical garden sculptures, even ornate furniture pieces, lay scattered on his workbench. He'd research obscure alloys, spend hours watching online tutorials for advanced welding techniques, and meticulously price out custom orders he'd never actually received. He knew the tensile strength of every metal, the exact heat needed for a perfect bead, the precise tools for every cut and curve. He knew everything, it seemed, except how to start. Every night he'd tell himself, tomorrow I'll clear that bench, call that supplier, start on that sample piece for the online portfolio. He yearned to put his creativity to use, to build something with his own hands that wasn't just another part for another machine, but a piece of himself. The thought of his own custom metalwork shop, Wyatt's Forge, had been a quiet hum in his chest for years, a persistent melody beneath the factory's roar. He imagined the satisfaction of seeing a customer's face light up, the pride of standing next to a finished piece, knowing every curve, every weld, every polished surface was his. But then the fatigue would set in, a heavy blanket after a long day, or the doubt would creep in, a cold whisper in the back of his mind. It's too big. You don't have enough money. What if it fails? What if you're not good enough? What if you mess it up and then you've wasted everything? He'd trace the lines of a complex design with his finger, imagining the process, the precision needed, and then he'd sigh. Not ready yet. Gotta refine the plans. Gotta save a little more. Gotta be perfect before I even try. So the welder stayed cold, the lathe remained silent, and the blueprints gathered a fine layer of dust. He closed the garage door, plunging his aspirations back into darkness, and walked back to the quiet house. A quick shower, a simple meal, maybe a short call with his mother, whose gentle voice was a comfort but also sometimes a reminder of the passing years. As he lay in bed, the silence of the house amplified the nagging voice of regret. Another day gone. Another day spent making someone else's parts, while his own dreams remained on paper, trapped in the tomorrow that never seemed to arrive. He was 43, and the quiet strength in his eyes was slowly, imperceptibly being worn down by the dull ache of unfulfilled potential. The slow, agonizing erosion of hope, born not from failure but from the fear of even trying. He drifted to sleep, the factory's rhythm still echoing in his bones, his dream shop a vivid yet ever-distant mirage. The factory floor, a symphony of grinding metal and hydraulic hisses, was Wyatt's second home, familiar as the calluses on his palms. He'd seen a lot of faces come and go over the years, some grizzled veterans like himself, others fresh out of high school, full of piss and vinegar. One of the newer ones was a kid named Manny, maybe 25, thin as a rail, with an infectious, slightly naive enthusiasm that Wyatt found both endearing and a little irritating. Manny worked on the line, just a few stations down, feeding sheet metal into a press brake, day in and day out. Wyatt noticed Manny had a habit during lunch breaks of not just scrolling on his phone like everyone else, but hunching over it, eyes glued, sometimes whispering into it. He'd seen Manny sketching too, quick, almost crude drawings in a small notebook, usually on his 30-minute dinner break. Wyatt paid it no mind, figured it was some video game or a girl. People had their ways of escaping. But then one Tuesday, during the morning coffee run, Wyatt was standing by the vending machine, nursing a lukewarm cup when Manny was at the water cooler talking to old Frank, the shop steward. Wyatt usually tuned out the chatter, but a few words snagged his attention. "Yeah, man, just got another order for those custom bottle openers," Manny was saying, a proud, almost disbelieving grin on his face. "Guy found me on Instagram, said he loved the rustic finish." Frank grunted. "Bottle openers, huh? You doing that in your garage, kid?" Manny nodded, bouncing on the balls of his feet. "Yeah, got a cheap little plasma cutter, a grinder, and a good torch. Nothing fancy. Takes me maybe an hour a night after work, sometimes less. But the orders are starting to pile up, man. Thinking of expanding to custom keychains next." He pulled out his phone, his screen lit up with a brightly colored photo of a dozen rustic, heavy-gauge steel bottle openers, each with a unique, hand-cut design. They weren't perfect, Wyatt noted instantly, his inner critic already firing. The edges were a little rough, the finish uneven in spots, a far cry from the immaculate precision he envisioned for his own creations. But they were real. They were done. And they were selling. A cold knot tightened in Wyatt's stomach. Manny, with his cheap plasma cutter and his maybe an hour a night, was doing it. He was building something, however small, however imperfect, out of metal, just like Wyatt dreamed of. Manny didn't have years of blueprints, nor the latest top-of-the-line equipment, certainly not Wyatt's honed skill. He just started. He just showed up, every single day. Wyatt felt a sudden, crushing weight, as if all the years he'd spent meticulously planning, researching, perfecting his idea were pressing down on him. He looked at his own calloused hands, hands capable of so much more, hands that held the potential to craft things of beauty and lasting quality. And yet those hands remained idle in his own garage, waiting for the perfect moment, waiting for more money, waiting for less fatigue. Waiting for the tomorrow that Manny was already living today with far less. The shift bell rang, a jarring clang that pulled Wyatt from his silent internal shock. He walked back to his station, the familiar drone of the machinery now sounding like a mocking chorus. Manny's simple bottle openers, imperfect as they were, had chipped away at the foundation of Wyatt's carefully constructed excuses. It wasn't about skill. It wasn't about capital. It wasn't about readiness. It was about action. And Wyatt, for all his silent strength and quiet resilience, had been choosing inaction every single day. The knowledge was a bitter pill, a poison he'd been slowly administering to himself for years. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The old house was still, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. Wyatt lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, the shadows playing tricks in the faint glow of the street lamp outside his window. His mind, usually lulled into a quiet hum after a day's work, was a tempest. He looked at the digital clock on his nightstand. 3:17 a.m., 3:17 in the morning, a time for secrets, for raw truths. What was he doing? What had he become? The carefully constructed image of himself, the diligent planner, the patient perfectionist, the man biding his time, shattered into 1,000 pieces. He wasn't biding his time, he was wasting it. Wasn't a diligent planner, he was a terrified procrastinator. He thought of Manny's rough-hewn bottle openers, then of his own meticulously drawn blueprints, gathering dust in his garage. His designs were superior, yes, more intricate, more ambitious. But Manny's were real. Manny was making money, building a business, learning lessons firsthand. Wyatt was still in the hypothetical, trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, a cage fashioned from what-ifs, and not yet. A deep, guttural sigh escaped him, a sound filled with years of unspoken regret. He felt a profound sense of self-betrayal. He de-promised himself for years that someday he'd build his dream. But someday was a thief, a smooth talker that stole your present while whispering sweet nothings about your future. And the future it promised never arrived. He saw himself as if from above, a man in his prime, with strong hands and a sharp mind, yet paralyzed by an invisible fear. Fear of failing, yes, but even more insidious, a fear of not being perfect. He'd rather not try at all than risk producing something less than flawless. That fear had kept his welder cold, his lathe silent, and his dreams locked away in the darkness of his garage. It had made him complicit in his own stagnation. He'd become a phantom of his own potential. The weight of it all was suffocating. He'd given his best years, his most productive hours, to building other people's dreams, fabricating other companies' parts. And what did he have to show for his own? A stack of drawings and a garage full of silent potential. The quiet strength in his eyes had been a mask, he realized now. Underneath it was a simmering resentment, not for others, but for himself. He was 43, and the man he was looking at in the dark of his bedroom was not the man he had intended to be. The raw, brutal honesty of that 3 a.m. hour cut deeper than any metal ever could. The raw, brutal honesty of that 3 a.m. hour cut deeper than any metal ever could. It left a wound, throbbing and exposed, as he dragged himself out of bed a few hours later, the usual clang and hiss of the factory floor already echoing in his mind. The morning commute, the familiar turn of the key in the ignition, the stale coffee from the thermos, it all felt heavier, tainted by the truth he'd finally faced in the darkness. He punched the clock, the digital display glowing a stark 5:58 a.m., and walked onto the shop floor. The air, thick with the scent of machining oil and metal dust, was a familiar comfort and a bitter prison all at once. He nodded to Big Jim, a man whose hands were as gnarled as oak roots, and started up his press. The rhythmic thump and shudder quickly lulled him back into the trance of routine, a deceptive peace that let his mind wander, pushing the gnawing truths back into the shadows. It was during his mid-morning break, huddled over a lukewarm cup of coffee, that the crack began to form. He saw Leah, a kid barely out of trade school, probably 26 or 27, slouched against a workbench, his face lit by the glow of his phone. Leo wasn't a bad kid. He was eager, a little rough around the edges with his welds, but he showed up, every single day. He had less experience than Wyatt had calluses, less capital than Wyatt had spare change in his pocket, yet there he was, always tinkering with something on his phone during breaks. Wyatt had watched Leo for weeks, months even. He knew Leo was trying to sell custom keychains and bottle openers online, stuff made from scrap metal Wyatt himself often tossed in the bin. Wyatt had even offered a few pointers, some tricks for better finishes, thinking of it as a nice, harmless hobby for the kid. Leo's setup in his small apartment was probably a fraction of what Wyatt had, gathering dust in his own garage. A cheap welder, a grinding wheel, a few hand tools. No fancy plasma cutter, no industrial-grade lathe. Just simple, honest work. Today, though, was different. Leo's usual quiet concentration was replaced by a small, triumphant fist pump. He scrolled through his phone, a wide grin spreading across his face, then looked up, catching Wyatt's eye. "Got another one, Wyatt?" Leo practically vibrated with quiet excitement. "Someone in California ordered 2 custom pieces. Took a while to get the word out, but it's picking up. Had a few regulars already." Wyatt nodded, a tight smile playing on his lips. "That's good, Leo, real good." But inside, a cold shard of ice pierced through the carefully constructed walls around Wyatt's ambition. He saw Leo's pride, the simple joy of a man building something of his own, and it wasn't just the sale that hit him. It was the process. Leo hadn't waited for a bigger workshop or a more advanced degree or a perfect marketing plan. He hadn't waited until he was ready. He simply started. Every day, even if it was just answering an email or putting up one more picture or practicing one more weld on a scrap piece, he showed up. That evening, the metallic tang of the factory floor clung to Wyatt's skin like a shroud, and the hum of the machinery echoed in his ears long after he'd turned off the ignition in his driveway. The house felt colder than usual, the silence heavier. He walked straight past the garage, the very place that housed his silent dreams, as if it were a tombstone for his potential. He skipped dinner, the thought of food curdling in his stomach. He just slumped onto the worn couch, the late afternoon sun casting long, accusatory shadows across the living room. The truth, already glimpsed at 3 a.m. that morning, now stood fully exposed, mercilessly illuminated by Leo's simple triumph. Leo, with his cheap tools and his apartment-sized dreams, was doing what Wyatt, with his inherited garage full of meticulously planned layouts and professional-grade blueprints, was only dreaming about. Leo had less skill, less experience, less capital, and yet he was further ahead. It wasn't about the quantity of resources, it was about the quality of the effort. Or rather, the simple fact of any effort at all. As the house darkened and the clock crept towards another agonizing 3 a.m., Wyatt lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His own words, the ones he'd whispered to himself for years. "I'll start tomorrow. I need to learn more. I don't have enough money yet." They all sounded like hollow excuses now. A grand, elaborate performance to avoid the simple, terrifying act of beginning. He had built an empire of procrastination, each. What if? A brick each. Not yet. A layer of mortar. He saw the faces of the men he worked with, men who had long given up on their own aspirations, their eyes dulled by routine, their dreams replaced by the steady thump of the press. Was that his future? Was he already one of them, just better at hiding it? The quiet strength in his eyes, which he thought was resilience, was actually the strength of his denial, a stubborn refusal to face the truth. Leo hadn't just made a sale. He had ignited a bomb inside Wyatt's carefully constructed world of excuses. The silence of his own workshop now screamed with the accusations of wasted years, of unfulfilled potential, of a life lived perpetually on the verge of starting, but never truly beginning. The weight of it pressed down on him, crushing him under the sheer, brutal honesty of his own inaction. He was not afraid of failing. He was terrified of trying, of exposing his own vulnerability to the world, of not being perfect. And that fear, that insidious, paralyzing fear, had cost him everything. The weight in Wyatt's chest became a physical thing, like the old, rusted engine block he'd once tried to lift alone. It pressed, it squeezed, until something inside him finally gave way. Not a snap, more like a sigh, a slow, grudging release. He lay there for what felt like hours, not fighting the truth anymore, but letting it settle over him, cold and hard. "Enough," he whispered into the darkness. The word was barely audible, a ragged breath escaping his lips, yet it carried the weight of 43 years. Enough of the waiting. Enough of the almost. Enough of the promises he made to himself that crumbled into dust with the first ray of morning light. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have a sudden flash of brilliance, no magic bullet for all his problems. There was no grand revelation about what to do next. Only a profound, gut-wrenching certainty that this cycle of dreaming and delaying, of hoping and hiding, simply could not continue. He couldn't go back to pretending. He couldn't keep lying to the man in the mirror. When the alarm shrieked at 5 a.m., it sounded different this time. Less like a nagging obligation, more like a challenge. Every fiber of Wyatt's being screamed for just 5 more minutes for the comforting oblivion of the pillow. His muscles ached from the factory floor, his mind was a fog from the sleepless night. The familiar routine, like a powerful current, tried to pull him under. Hit snooze, drag himself to the kitchen, brew coffee, eat a stale bagel, go to work, repeat. It was the easiest path, the well-worn groove he'd cut for himself over decades. But enough, echoed in his head. Sat up, his feet hit the cold floor. The simple act felt monumental, like pushing against a wall that had stood for years. He shuffled to the bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, looked at himself. The quiet strength was still there in his eyes, but it was tinged with a new, raw vulnerability. The factory called, the lunch pail sat ready, the keys to the old pickup lay on the counter. Everything pulling him towards another day of the same. But today he had made a decision. A decision not about what he would become, but about how he would face this one single day. He walked past the kitchen, past the front door, and found himself in the detached garage. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of oil and metal. Tools hung on pegboards, organized with the precision of a man who loved his craft, even if he rarely practiced it. His half-finished designs lay under a dusty tarp. He picked up a piece of scrap metal, a thick, awkward square of steel that had been sitting on his workbench for months, waiting. He pulled on his welding helmet, the familiar weight a small comfort. His hands, calloused and strong, found the welding torch. It felt heavy, cold, almost alien in its dormancy. "Just 15 minutes," he mumbled to himself, the words raspy. "Just 15 minutes, Wyatt, then you can go to work." He flipped the switch, the old welder hummed to life, a low, mechanical growl. The arc flared, a sudden, blinding white light. Sparks showered, a tiny, defiant fireworks display in the dim garage. His first pass was shaky, ugly, a jagged, uneven seam. He frowned, frustration bubbling up. "See, you're no good. What's the point?" The old voice, his oldest enemy, whispered in his ear. But he kept going. Another pass, a little steadier. Then another. The smell of burning metal filled the air, acrid but strangely satisfying. It wasn't perfect. Far from it. But for the first time in years, the hum of the welder wasn't just background noise. It was the sound of something starting. When the timer on his phone buzzed 15 minutes later, his muscles ached. His eyes were still adjusting, but he hadn't stopped. He had done it. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, a faint smile touching his lips. It was a tiny victory, almost imperceptible. But it was a victory nonetheless. And for Wyatt, that was everything. The next morning, the alarm felt heavier. The victory of yesterday, so bright at the time, now seemed like a distant, small thing swallowed by the vast, gray landscape of another workday. His body groaned a little louder getting out of bed, a protest against the cold floor and the looming shift. He felt the pull, strong and insistent, to just skip it. Just today. Get an extra 15 minutes of sleep, feel a little less rushed. The garage would still be there tonight, wouldn't it? But then he pictured Michael, that young kid with the easy smile and the bustling online store. Michael hadn't waited for perfect. Michael had just started. Wyatt took a deep breath, the cold air burning a little in his lungs. He walked to the garage. The steel square was still on the workbench, dull under the single bulb. He pulled on the helmet. Torch felt less alien today, but still heavy. The familiar hum of the welder was less a promise and more a demanding drone. His passes were still shaky, the metal reluctant to join. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus, to push through the stiffness in his shoulders, the dull ache behind his eyes. When the timer buzzed, it was relief, pure and simple. Not joy, not triumph. Just relief that he hadn't caved. Just relief that he had shown up. Day 3 was a grinding replay. Day 4, a test of his resolve when he felt a cold coming on, his head foggy. He cut his session short, only 10 minutes, but he didn't skip. He pushed through the discomfort, the lethargy. Each morning was a quiet argument in his own head, a wrestling match between the voice that said, "What's the point?" and the one still small that whispered, "Just 15 minutes, Wyatt, just one step." By the end of the first week, the initial flicker of hope had dimmed. It wasn't getting easier. His welds weren't magically transforming into masterpieces. If anything, some days felt like he was getting worse, his hands too tired, his concentration broken by the endless drone of the factory floor still ringing in his ears. He was exhausted, sleeping less, feeling the weight of the new routine on top of the old one. He came home one Friday night, the smell of grease and stale metal clinging to his clothes. He showered, ate a microwave meal, and stared at the garage door. It might as well have been a stone wall. His mind screamed, "No, just rest. You earned it." He sat on the worn couch, remote in hand, flicking through channels he didn't care about. He tried to relax, but his stomach churned. He felt a different kind of exhaustion tonight, a hollow, unsettling feeling. It was the exhaustion of not doing, of knowing he was letting himself down. He thought of all those years, all those tomorrows that had bled into each other, forming a vast, stagnant lake of regret. He pictured the empty space in the garage where his metalworking dreams should have taken root. That picture was worse than any fatigue. He dragged himself up. His muscles protested. His mind lobbied hard for bed. He didn't want to go to the garage. He really didn't. But he opened the door anyway, the cold air hitting his face. He didn't even put on his work clothes. He just pulled on the helmet, picked up the torch, and started to weld in his sweatpants and an old t-shirt. The arc flared, blinding him, momentarily burning away the doubts. His hands were clumsy tonight, the weld ugly, pockmarked. He tried again. And again, frustration built into a tight knot in his chest. He slammed the torch down, the clang echoing sharply in the quiet garage. "This is useless," he growled, the words tasting bitter. "You're just wasting your time, Wyatt. You're no good at this. Never have been." The old voice, his oldest enemy, was screaming now. He stared at the messed-up piece of metal, a monument to his perceived failure. He wanted to walk away, to lock the door, to forget this foolishness. He closed his eyes, his breathing ragged. He stood there for a long moment, the silence of the garage pressing in around him. Then slowly he opened his eyes. He picked up the torch. His hand, though trembling slightly, was steady. He turned the metal over, exposing a fresh, untouched surface. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "Just one more," he whispered, his voice hoarse but determined. "Just one more pass." He aimed the torch, and the sparks flew again, a tiny, defiant rebellion against the voices in his head. It was still imperfect, but it was a step. And in that moment, in that raw, ugly, imperfect attempt, Wyatt found a strength he hadn't known he possessed. The strength to fail, and then the quiet, stubborn will to try again. And again. That stubborn, "just one more pass," became a quiet mantra, a daily ritual. Day after day, the garage light would flick on, a defiant beacon in the working-class night. His neighbors, who initially might have wondered what racket Wyatt was making, simply grew accustomed to the rhythmic clang of metal, the hiss of the grinder, the sharp crackle of the welder. It was a constant, low hum in the background of their own lives. For Wyatt, those first few weeks were a brutal slog. The internal voices hadn't vanished. They just changed their tune from screaming to a persistent, nagging whisper. "Still not good enough. You're wasting electricity. This will never amount to anything." He'd go to bed with a dull ache in his shoulders and a throbbing behind his eyes, the metallic tang of grinding dust still clinging to his nostrils. But he'd wake up, pull on his work clothes for the factory, and carry the memory of that last, imperfect weld with him. And then he'd return to it, every single night. Around the 3-week mark, something started to shift. It wasn't a sudden epiphany, more like the slow turning of a massive, rusty gear. His hands, once clumsy and hesitant, began to move with a nascent confidence. The arc of the weld became smoother, the beads more uniform. He wasn't just going through the motions, he was learning. He'd spend hours poring over online videos, learning new techniques, then immediately trying to replicate them, his brow furrowed in concentration. The garage floor, once a chaotic collection of tools and discarded metal, began to take on a semblance of order. He started clearing space, organizing his welding rods by type, his grinders by grit. It wasn't just a place to dream anymore. It was a place where work was happening. At the factory, the change was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. He still worked his shift, punched his clock, did his job with the same quiet diligence. But there was a new spring in his step, a slight lift in his chin. His eyes, once shadowed with a perpetual weariness, held a different light, not joy, not yet, but something akin to quiet purpose. He still listened more than he spoke, but now when someone talked about a problem, Wyatt's mind was often already halfway to a solution, picturing the mechanics, the angles, the materials. He was no longer just a body on the line. He was a mind, engaged and alive. One afternoon during a coffee break, young Kevin, the colleague whose side hustle had sparked Wyatt's shift, sat down beside him. "Hey, Wyatt," he began, stirring his coffee. "You look different." Wyatt grunted, taking a sip of his own lukewarm brew. "How so?" Kevin shrugged. "Just got a bit more bounce in your step, you know, like you figured something out." He paused, then leaned in slightly. "You still tinkering in that garage of yours?" Wyatt looked at him, a flicker of a smile playing on his lips. "Tinkering," he repeated, the word sounding inadequate for the hours he was putting in. "Yeah, I'm still at it." He didn't elaborate, didn't boast. He just met Kevin's gaze, and for the first time in years there was no shame, no self-reproach in his eyes, only a quiet resolve. Kevin nodded slowly, a look of understanding dawning on his face. He saw it. He saw the change. Weeks blurred into months. The factory work remained a constant, but it was no longer the defining feature of Wyatt's existence. It was the background hum, the reliable engine that funded his true work. His evenings in the garage became less a battle, more a communion. He started to tackle small, practical projects. A robust new bracket for his workbench, a decorative metal sign for his mother's garden, sturdy repairs on old tools. Each finished piece, no matter how minor, was a small victory, a tangible monument to his persistence. He wasn't just making metal, he was making progress. His workshop, once a graveyard of forgotten ambitions, was now humming with life. The smell of grinding metal and hot flux mingled with the faint scent of oil. Tools hung neatly on pegboards, their outlines traced in marker. A small, second-hand metal lathe had found its place in a corner, its surface gleaming. He'd saved up for it, one extra hour of overtime at the factory, one less frivolous purchase. His drawings, once just fantasies on paper, now had physical counterparts taking shape on his workbench. Wyatt himself was still Wyatt, the same quiet, dependable man. His hands were still calloused, his uniform still bore the faint smell of oil and grit. But his eyes were different. They held a depth, a clarity that hadn't been there before. They scanned his surroundings not with resignation, but with observation, with possibility. He moved with a subtle ease, his shoulders no longer slumping under the invisible weight of unspoken dreams. He carried himself with a quiet strength, the kind that comes from facing down your own doubts day after day and simply showing up. He wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, but he was building something, one deliberate, imperfect step at a time. He was building a future, not just waiting for one. The shift wasn't a lightning bolt, more like the slow turning of a tide. At first, no one at the factory noticed much beyond Wyatt's usual quiet demeanor. But as the days rolled into weeks, and the weeks into months, subtle changes began to ripple out from him. He still worked his shift with the same relentless grit, but the deep lines of weariness around his eyes seemed to soften, replaced by a glint of something akin to purpose. His lunch breaks, once spent staring blankly at a wall, now saw him sketching on a small pad or reading trade magazines, his brow furrowed in concentration, not despair. He was still the first to offer a hand, the last to complain, but there was a new energy in his movements, a subtle spring in his step. The perpetual slump in his shoulders had straightened. Even his laugh, a rare, gruff sound before, seemed to come a little easier, a little more often. One afternoon, old man Jenkins, a supervisor who'd seen 100 Wyatts come and go, leaned against a drill press watching him. "Wyatt," he rumbled, his voice like gravel, "you been looking different lately." "What's the secret? Find a rich aunt?" Wyatt paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. "No, sir, just finally started doing a little something for myself after all these years." He didn't elaborate and Jenkins didn't press, but the old man nodded slowly, a knowing look in his eyes as if he recognized the quiet spark of a man finally claiming his own. The shop wasn't just humming, it was churning. Wyatt had taken on a few small custom orders through a local hardware store, intricate garden gates, sturdy railings for a porch, a unique sign for a new diner. Each project was a leap of faith, a chance to apply the skills he'd hoarded for so long. He taught himself new techniques from online videos, practicing late into the night, the arc welder spitting sparks like tiny stars in the gloom. He made mistakes, plenty of them. Welds were ugly at first, cuts uneven. But he'd learned to fix them, to grind away the imperfections, to learn from every misstep. The fear of not being ready had been replaced by the grit of simply doing. His house, too, began to reflect the change. It wasn't just tidy, it felt lived in, actively shaped. The garage door, once a barrier to his dreams, was now often open, a beacon of industrious light in the evenings. His mother, calling him from a few towns over, noticed the shift in his voice, the lightness in his updates. He still called to check on her, but now he had stories to tell, small victories to share. The weight of someday had lifted, replaced by the satisfaction of today. Wyatt didn't wake up one morning a different man. He woke up every morning, still tired, still facing the daily grind, but now he had a choice. And every single day he chose to show up for himself, to take one small, imperfect step. The grand dream of his own shop, once a crushing burden of expectation, had fractured into 1,000 tiny, achievable actions. And in doing so, it had become real. He wasn't waiting for the perfect moment anymore. He was building it, piece by deliberate piece. The self-doubt hadn't vanished entirely, but it had shrunk, replaced by the quiet, undeniable proof of his own persistence. He saw his calloused hands, not as symbols of endless toil, but as instruments of creation, capable of shaping raw metal into something beautiful and lasting. What he learned wasn't some grand secret whispered by a guru. It was simpler, harder, and more true than anything he'd ever read in a book. He learned that the chasm between dreaming and doing wasn't bridged by one heroic leap, but by the relentless, almost boring consistency of showing up. It ain't about some big revelation or a lucky break that drops out of the sky. It's about that one small decision you make every single morning. Are you gonna take one step, even a tiny one, towards what you say you want, or are you just gonna let another day slip through your fingers, waiting for someday that never comes? That's it. That's the whole damn thing. That's what separates the ones who get there from the ones who just watch their lives go by. It's the difference between wishing and building, and that, my friends, is the simple, brutal truth of it. There are no shortcuts, no